Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome along to what the Israeli papers say here at Real Israel. This is Paul Alster with you once again, and I'm really pleased that we're able to look at some of the issues in the news. We have some very interesting angles on the situations here in Israel and the region. And we've got two great guests with us this week. I'm delighted to welcome along for the first time Itamar Marcus, who is the founder and director of Palestinian Media Watch, which focuses, amongst other things, on the indoctrination of children by the Palestinian media. Now, he's addressed parliamentarians in many countries, including the United States, across the European Union, Canada and Australia. He lives in Efrat in the West Bank. Very good to have you with us, Itamar. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be, and thank you for inviting me, Paul.
It's really good. And back with us for more is a regular on the show, Benjamin Weinthal, who is, of course, a European correspondent for the Jerusalem Post and a fellow at the Washington-based Foundation for Defense of Democracies, for whom I see he's described as the eyes and ears in Europe. Benjamin is based both in Jerusalem and in Berlin. Benjamin, welcome back. Really good to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's a pleasure.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, as always, and quite a lot of news all over the region on many different fronts. And we're going to look at four different stories, really, over the course of the next half hour or so. Now, I'm going to turn to Itamar, first of all, because his organization obviously focuses specifically on what's being said in the Palestinian media. And one of the most prominent figures, Itamar, that international audiences will have seen over many years is Hanan Ashrawi, who's been a very vocal spokesperson for the Palestinians. And she announced her resignation recently. Now, before we come on to specifics of one or two of the stories you want to focus on, how would you describe her time as a spokesman for the Palestinians? Has she made any particularly meaningful contribution?
Well, Hanan Ashrawi was known, I would say, maybe known better for the international community than she even was for Palestinians. She occasionally appeared in the Palestinian press, but she was primarily used for them as a face for the international community because they felt, one, she was a woman, two, she spoke English very well, and she spoke in a logical manner and defended the Palestinian issues. Within the Palestinian Authority, she really does not have very much clout or power. She was never one of those figures who, when there'd be polls, who do you see as a potential leader? She wasn't even included in that category of potential leaders. So her resignation, while significant internationally and will certainly hurt the Palestinians when they try to present their image internationally, internally within the Palestinian Authority, it was hardly a bleep in the news stories.
And coming on the back of the loss of Saeb Erekat, is there any connection there? Is it a changing of the guard of these familiar faces that people have been seeing internationally representing a Palestinian viewpoint? And she also made some rather pointed comments in her resignation letter to Abu Mazen that suggested she wasn't happy with the way things were going.
Yes, she didn't make it clear what exactly she wasn't happy about. The fact is, the polls in Palestinian polls, by Palestinian pollsters for the last number of years have found about 80% of Palestinians thinking that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt, and 60% or more in every poll saying that they want Abbas to resign. Abbas, as you know, was elected over 15 years ago to a 5-year term, but he never has allowed to have elections since then. So there's a lot of frustration amongst Palestinians in general with the Palestinian Authority, again, for the lack of democracy, no freedom of expression. People who criticize the government or Abbas himself will end up in prison. I would even go beyond that. There are Palestinians who are working very actively now to try to create a platform for Palestinians who want to speak out for peace with Israelis. And these people are so secretive about their opinions, just wanting peace with Israelis, because they're afraid that someone will talk against them and they'll end up in a Palestinian prison as well. And these are young Palestinians who've met Israelis, realize that we really aren't out to get them, but the opposite, we want to live in peace beside them. And they are building very strong bridges. And these people are afraid to speak out because of the Palestinian Authority police. So what's happening now is there is a lot of opposition to Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority on so many levels. Like I said, 60% for years have wanted him to resign and call elections. So I think Hanan Ashrawi's criticism of the Palestinian Authority is really expressing a very popular opinion in the Palestinian Authority right now of criticism of the leadership.
And Benjamin, just before I come back to Itamar for the first specific story, as regards Hanan Ashrawi, a very vocal spokeswoman for the Palestinians, and if I understand as well, she was a Christian, not Muslim, and the Christian communities within the Palestinian Authority haven't flourished under the Palestinians. Do you see her loss from an international perspective, Benjamin, as being a blow to the Palestinian media machine?
Well, as Itamar mentioned, she's she has great presentation skills because she's fluent in English. She earned her PhD in comparative literature at the University of Virginia. But at the same time, she's has expressed some very unsavory views. Her NGO, which purports to present or disseminate the Palestinian narrative, in 2013 published an article alleging that Jews use Christian blood to bake Passover matzah, the classic anti-Semitic blood libel. And only after massive pressure did her NGO withdraw the organization, withdraw the article, but then attack the blogger that exposed this anti-Semitic narrative. And she also supports the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel, a movement that's been declared anti-Semitic by the U.S. government and the parliaments of Germany and Austria. So she's not someone who's into the business of peace as mainstream peace, as we've seen over the last few months with normalization agreements with Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and probably other countries that are in the dock, so to speak. The Palestinian the disputed territories have seen a decrease in their Christian population. Is the only country in the Middle East where there's actually been a growth of Middle East Christians is the state of Israel. So the persecution of Christians in the Middle East and in the disputed Palestinian territories has not been a topic of her interest.
Which is surprising, isn't it? It's surprising as a Christian that she didn't seek to raise that subject more. I think I just want to come to Itamar to talk about an article that was published on your website, the Palestinian Media Watch, which kind of puts in a nutshell some of the things that Benjamin was highlighting. Was the indoctrination, which of course you have focused on for so many years. And it was an article that we'll be seeing on screen here about a Palestinian television quiz show in which there were songs about different ways of killing Israelis and Jews. How typical was that action? Was it a one-off, or is this something that is presented regularly in the mainstream Palestinian media?
This particular song has been on Palestinian television numerous times for a number of years. And in general, the Palestinian Authority has no problem putting on music videos. What we're finding in recent years is that the Palestinian Authority has an ideology, and the ideology is one that legitimizes, they call it resistance. In fact, it's murdering of Israeli civilians. They claim that the international community, the UN, has backed up their right to do everything that they can, and therefore they claim that even killing Israelis is okay. So you have the political leaders who approach this issue from a legal point of view, saying we have a right to resist, Then you have the religious leaders who go on television approaching a different direction, and they will cite Islamic sources. For example, and this is important, the minister, former minister of religion, he's now Abbas's advisor on Islam. His name is Mahmoud al-Habash. Earlier this year, went on television and he quoted from the Quran 3 times. He said the Quran says, kill them, kill them, kill them. Says, who should we be killing? And then he lists 10 people who should be killed according to the Quran. He says, people who take your land, take your homeland, threaten your land, threaten your homeland, threaten your rights. He listed 10 things, all of which are things that the Palestinian Authority accuses Israel of. And here you've got the most important religious figure saying that the Quran is obligating you to fight them and even kill them, talking about Israelis. And he ends up with a quote from the Quran, and he says, quote, kill them wherever you find them. Again, now in the Quran, significantly, that quote doesn't apply to Jews. But he applied that quote to Israel today, kill them wherever you find them. So political leaders say it's justified. Religious leaders say it's a religious obligation. And then comes the need to approach youth. And how are youth approached with this? Youth are approached through music videos. And that's where this music video that you're talking about comes in. And dozens like this that glorify the killing of Jews and Israelis in their neighborhoods, wherever they are. So what you have is a Palestinian Authority that is literally covering all the grounds, politically, religiously, and then popularizing the killing of Israelis, even through music videos. And we've been seeing this literally starting, I would say, since the days of the Intifada 2000 through 2004, and it has never stopped. It was more active during the Intifada, but today it continues until today, has never left the Palestinian, official Palestinian messaging.
And the interesting thing, and I'm sure it's something that your organization has, basically fought to try and present, is that internationally these type of issues often are not highlighted, and there seems to be a reluctance in some of the mainstream media to highlight exactly what's being said sort of behind the hand by the Palestinians to the local populations, who some people would say in some ways are very unfortunate that they have very little democracy, they have corrupt leadership, and they're being brainwashed out of their future prosperity, really. If they were to change their tune, surely life would be a lot better for them and a lot easier as well in many respects for people in Israel. Would you agree with that, Itamar? Benjamin, I'll come to you on that point as well in a moment.
I agree with you totally on that. In fact, the title of a lecture I recently gave to members of parliaments from Africa was the Palestinian Authority abuse of their own children. And what I showed and what I presented is that these children are victims as well, terrible victims. When there's one video which I presented to them, which Fatah put on its Facebook page, has a young girl reciting a poem or a little story, really, where a mother in this story says to a child, when she hands a child a rifle, and the child says, "Why are you giving me a rifle?" And then the mother tells the child, "I'm giving you the rifle because you were not destined for happiness. You are destined for martyrdom. Islam is our weapon. You, my son, are the ammunition, and you are destined for martyrdom." And as I've said many times, there is nothing worse that you could tell a child, or nothing more abusive than to tell a child that you have no value in and of yourself. Your only value is ammunition for another cause. And that's right. And that's what Fatah thought was important to put on their Facebook page. This is Fatah, not Hamas. So this child abuse, and Palestinian children are suffering terribly, like you said.
Yeah, and just very quickly to Benjamin on this one, that there also seems to be a perception, you correct me if I'm wrong, that in the international media, Hamas are very clearly terrorists from their actions in Gaza, but there seems to be a view that Fatah in the West Bank is much more benign and less terrorist inclined. And the truth might be that Hamas are more open about what they want to do, whereas Fatah are more in the West Bank, that is the Palestinian Authority, are more able to disguise what some of their ultimate aims are.
Well, yes. I mean, there was a big there was a public row in Germany over the last few weeks about the Social Democratic Party's youth movement or youth organization, which is young adults, teenagers, and people in their 20s, early 30s, who at their conference declared the Fatah Youth Movement their sister organization and gave the Fatah Youth Organization a veto right over any potential peace process with the Israelis. So this is a mainstream social democratic youth organization or young adult organization that grooms leaders to be the next chancellor and ministers in the government. It's a very important organization. It differs in many ways from other political youth organizations in the West because of its very important role in determining future leaders. And this organization aligned itself with an anti-Semitic, the German organization aligned itself with an anti-Semitic Fatah movement that supports BDS. And if you look at their emblems on their webpage and social media, declares all of Israel to be a future Palestinian state. And that's nothing short of lethal anti-Semitism. So the Europeans, in this case the Germans, are mainstreaming this type of genocidal anti-Semitism from a youth organization. And Israel is going to have a problem, I think, dealing with this party because it's in the coalition government with Merkel.
Yeah. Well, nobody's saying that Israel is completely flawless and has never done anything wrong at any time, but certainly there appears to be a great lack of balance internationally on the way that the situation within the Palestinian authorities is concerned. We're going to come back to more on that in due course, but I want to come to the second story, and we've selected a few headlines from such as Ynet and Israel Hayom and the Jerusalem Post, and you touched on this, Benjamin, a few moments ago about the feel-good story, the good news story in the region, which is the normalization of relations, which seem to be gathering strength. And in recent days, Morocco has joined the club, and also Bhutan, I understand, is another one that has normalized relations. And even today, there's some news, I think, breaking about an exchange of ambassadors renewing diplomatic contacts with Turkey, which I think is very interesting indeed. So there does appear to be some big momentum following on from the UAE and Bahrain a few weeks ago.
Right. This is really, a remarkable, an indescribably remarkable period because it's completely, these normalization agreements have radically altered the landscape of the Middle East and helped debunk BDS targeting Israel and all of these, cries about Israel as an isolated country, which I think were incredibly exaggerated and not grounded in reality. The Morocco case is important because the U.S., as we know, has granted Morocco the right to declare or recognize Western Sahara as part of its territory. That was a disputed territory, and there was an independence movement there that sought to break away from Morocco. And it's important because Iran and Hezbollah have backed this independence movement in the Western Sahara, and that's why Morocco broke off relations with Iran back in 2018. So there's a lot of geopolitics at work here. And of course, Algeria just issued a rather anti-Semitic statement over the weekend opposing this normalization process because Algeria supports the independence movement. Algeria's prime minister said, I'm quoting, "There is now a desire by the Zionist entity to come closer to our borders." So hopefully the incoming Biden administration can apply pressure on Algeria to normalize relations with Israel and put aside its obsolete sort of Cold War anti-Semitic rhetoric. And you mentioned other countries. One other country that I think I just saw today that's in the news again, and it's been in the news over the weekend, is Indonesia, which has the largest Muslim population in the world. And there seems to be a lot of chatter about Israel and Indonesia normalizing relations. So it's really, on many levels, it's a mind-blowing period.
Yeah, I mean, as far as Indonesia goes, it's somewhere I traveled quite extensively in actually some years ago. And as you pointed out, it is the most populous Muslim nation in the world. But my feelings there were that this is a country that was never, we've spoken about the Palestinians, but there was a great deal taught about Israel there that was quite shocking, particularly under Mahathir Mohamad, who was their long-standing prime minister. And I remember actually one story, meeting a group of lads in a city called Yogyakarta in Indonesia, and they came up to talk to me because they wanted to practice their English, and we spent the afternoon looking around some of the sites there. And at one point, this dates me actually, it was back in the 90s, I asked them, who is the person you most look up to in the world? And their response was Saddam Hussein. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. I was traveling as a Brit, not as an Israeli, and I asked them why. Because they said, well, he's the only person that's really going to stand up to Israel and try and kill the Jews. And that was from people that were very well educated, very, very nice, and completely shocked me. And that was almost a mainstream point of view at the time. Itamar, as far as the recognition from these countries, it has to be a good thing. And also, obviously, it's put the Palestinian Authority in a bit of position, because many of these countries have previously stated there would be no renewal of ties until there was a move on the peace negotiations with Israel, Land for Peace.
Yes, absolutely correct. The Palestinian Authority initially did not know how to respond properly to this, and they ended up literally demonizing all the leaders who were involved in this. There was one where they put the Crown Prince of the UAE in a garbage can, another one where he's stabbing them in the back. And they condemned them and cursed them, and they said that they're not welcome. In fact, there were some representatives from some of the Arab countries who came to the Temple Mount, and there was talk that they threw shoes at them. There were statements by the leaders: if you come to this area and you want to go to the Temple Mount, you are not welcome unless you come through the Palestinian route, which means coming through Jordan and then coming across. If you land in Ben Gurion Airport in Israel and then make your way to Jerusalem, you're not even welcome onto the Temple Mount, which is, of course, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. You're not welcome to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So then what happened was, after, I would say, at least a month of this, where they kept attacking every country that joined, they realized that they were burning every bridge that there was in the world. They were burning the bridges to the Arab countries who they need. They were burning the bridges to the West who supported this. They were also showing their true cards. Their true cards are that they are against peace with Israel. Their true cards are that they tell their people Palestine will be from the river to the sea. These are their true cards internally. This is how children are brought up. And by fighting any peace with Israel, they were really exposing themselves. And then they all of a sudden stopped. And what's happening now is the last few agreements, even Sudan and then now Morocco, they were completely silent. They didn't condemn, but they didn't say anything positive. It's as if you look at their newspapers, you won't even know that you hardly know that it even happened. It'll be brought up possibly as a parenthetical statement here and there. It'll be brought up even as a news story, but they're not willing to say anything negative. They realize they burned the bridges. So we're seeing a change in the Palestinian Authority attitude right now toward these countries because they need them.
And just a final word on this one with Benjamin. One of the interesting spin-offs of the new cooperation and openness between Israel and a number of the Arab states was the recent purchase this week of, or was it last week, of Beitar Yerushalayim, Beitar Jerusalem Football Club, which, of course, is a club that has a famous fan base that is known as the Familia, which is viciously anti-Arab and was very much against having Arab players on the team. This has to be a kind of an ironic happening, I would have thought, that all of a sudden now the UAE are buying into an organization that might possibly change attitudes within Israel as well among some of the populace here.
Yes, I mean, I think these types of partnerships, financial investments, are going to accelerate the normalization process, and it's all very encouraging. I mean, to see the constant flight traffic between Israel and the UAE and Israelis in Dubai and Emiratis in Israel. It certainly breeds inspiration. And I think, the larger point for me is what a colleague of mine wrote about at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Emmanuel Ottolenghi, is this normalization process debunks this myth that Jews and the state of Israel are not indigenous to the Middle East, and now that we see these normalization agreements with Sudan and Morocco, Bahrain, the UAE, and other countries that, as I mentioned, are waiting in the queue, we see that Israel is now being viewed as how Israelis view themselves, as a natural part of the region who have been here for thousands and thousands of years, and not something that was imposed on the region by external powers. And that's the larger sort of macro point that I think needs to get across, especially in Western Europe, that has where anti-Semitism is largely out of control and has a false narrative about the establishment of Israel and Israel's the rebirth of Israel.
If I could follow up on that just for 1 second, Paul. I agree completely with what Benjamin is saying, talking about this warm peace. I just want to point out something that's quite almost ironic, and that is that the peace that we're having now with these Gulf states is already warmer than the peace that Israel has with Egypt and Jordan for dozens of years. Israelis are really in danger if they go to Jordan. One of the translators of Palestinian Media Watch for many years was a young woman who grew up in Egypt and lived there till she was about 10 years ago. And she lived in Alexandria. She couldn't even, growing up, she did not even know she was Jewish. Her parents were afraid to tell her and her siblings they were Jews because there was so much anti-Semitism in Alexandria. We're talking now just a few years ago. In the end, when it was discovered that they were Jews, they had to run and leave because of the hatred of Jews and the hatred of Israel. This in a mainstream country, a mainstream city in Egypt. So the amazing thing that's happened is that we have a real warm peace. Israelis are anxious to have peace with the people. With Egypt and Jordan, we have peace at the leadership level only. It is this deep, whereas with the UAE, it seems like there's a real embracing of peace by both people, and this, of course, is wonderful.
Well, let's hope so. Long may it last. Of course, the proof will be in the pudding as we go forward. Just on a sort of, you mentioned the macro level, but on a smaller level, of course, Israel seems to have waived their restrictions of travel to Dubai, which is a red country with the coronavirus. And so as not to jeopardize any of the agreement, and there's reports in the newspaper that there could be many hundreds of Israelis coming back with coronavirus after visiting there, which is one side effect that maybe is less welcome, but we'll obviously monitor that and see how it plays out. But I want to move on back to another story that's been presented by Palestinian Media Watch, and this is essentially about the teachings within the Palestinians that they are, whatever age they are all refugees. Now, this status is a very controversial issue that gets a lot of people very hot under the collar. So, Itamar, we'll be looking at this as well as a piece that was on the UN's website, un.org, where they were calling for to stem the spread of misinformation. And I'm wondering how much you endorse the UN's view about spreading misinformation as well with regard to this subject of identifying Palestinians as refugees.
The interesting thing in this item that we directed you to on our website, this was just on Palestinian television recently. It's a new program where they interview children who are from what are called refugee camps, literally refugee camps, even though they're in the West Bank or in Gaza. And this boy lives near Ramallah. He's living right near the Palestinian Authority capital. And the moderator says to him, This boy is from Lod. Lod is an Israeli city near Tel Aviv. This boy has never been near Lod. He's never been there in his whole life. And then the boy says, yes, the Jews stole our land. Every day, every minute, I imagine that I'm in Lod. I will return and liberate Palestine. When he says, I'm going to liberate Palestine, he's talking about Israel. He's not talking about the West Bank and Gaza. And this is the way that children are being brought up there. And this is the great tragedy here, to impose this refugee status now on the third generation of human beings for political purpose is again another example of abuse of their people, of child abuse. The truth is that the ones in the West Bank don't have it as bad as the refugees in Lebanon. In Lebanon, the ones who are in refugee camps can't get jobs out of the camps, aren't allowed to own property out of the camps. There are dozens of restrictions on Lebanese, forcing them to not progress and not have a life, literally not have a free life. This is because they've been stigmatized and they've been literally held captive with this status of refugees. Now, please explain to me why someone living next to Ramallah should be called a refugee. This is the West Bank. The land is already Palestinian land completely. It's under the rule completely of the Palestinian Authority. Give them homes. Tell them you're a free person. Tell them you can live your life out here in Ramallah. No, the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, part of the Palestinian Authority, more than 50% of the people, close to 60% of the people are defined as refugees. That means, one, they have to get aid, international aid. In the last 10 years, the number of refugees has gone up, if I remember correctly, from about 4.5 million to 5.5 million refugees. So think of this ironic situation. You have billions of dollars, billions of pounds being poured into UNRWA to solve a refugee problem. And in the last 10 years, they've raised the number of refugees by literally, I think, 850,000 to 900,000 refugees. So how is that solving the problem? What's happening with this money? It is probably the worst investment the international community has ever done. They have spent billions and billions of dollars. And what started out as approximately 600,000, maybe a little more refugees, it has today grown to nearly 10 times that amount. You're not solving any problem. It's a UN agency to perpetuate the problem, and it must be fixed for the benefit of those Palestinians.
Yes, the implication being that these people, Benjamin, are being used as pawns, really, for political reasons, rather than the status of refugee really being based in any reality. But in Europe, where you report from a great deal, there's still a great deal of sympathy for the idea that the Palestinians, even children born in the last couple of years, are refugees from 1948 Palestine. Would I be correct in that?
Well, that is because many of the European governments provide the bulk of the funding to UNRWA, the UN agency that provides assistance to Palestinians who were displaced in 1948 after the War of Independence. These European governments and the UN, of course, are still wedded to this obsolete notion of what constitutes a refugee. It would be helpful over the next 2 months, or less than 2 months, if the Trump administration would release its updated unclassified report on the current number of people receiving UNRWA assistance, because that number, which is deemed to be not very high, certainly not over 5 million refugees, which is a bogus number. And we're talking about a very small number of real refugees who meet the criteria of what constitutes a refugee. If the Trump administration releases that report, I think it'll help persuade European governments and the UN to begin to rethink and hopefully discontinue funding for this agency that, as Itamar mentions, perpetuates a massive problem and also it's a massive hindrance to bringing about a two-state solution.
Well, just moving on from that, actually, to our fourth story, because one of the countries that obviously is always getting involved here in this region, either directly or through proxies, is Iran. And they've obviously been playing their part in supporting in Gaza, the Hamas, and in other areas. And I just want to come to you, Benjamin, here with there's another very, very worrying story where we're talking about press freedoms and the way things are reported and the perceptions. And the story that you wanted to highlight, reported, as we're showing here on the screen in the Jerusalem Post and on the Media Line as well, which was about an Iranian journalist who is the latest high-profile figure to have been executed. And this comes on the back of a story that you were very heavily involved in reporting on, which was the execution of the Iranian champion wrestler for trying to speak out for a more democratic way of life. And it's a shocking story, really, about this journalist that has lost his life.
Right. His name is Ruhollah Sam. He's a Iranian activist and journalist, and the son of a very famous Islamic Republic of Iran cleric who fled Iran and then was living in Paris as a journalist exposing corruption in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And he was lured back to Iran he was actually kidnapped by the Iranian intelligence service in Iraq and then taken to Iran and was given a sham trial and the usual forced confession that the Iranians have employed, and was executed on Saturday. This comes 3 months after the Iranian regime executed this very famous champion wrestler, Navid Afkari. Now, this story turned into a big social media campaign on the weekend because the Europeans, ambassadors from Germany, Austria, and France, were slated to hold an EU-Iran pro-business conference, a business conference to advance the economic interests of the Islamic Republic, with the EU paying for it and giving speeches. And it was a 3-day event involving a lot of organization and many speakers, including journalists from the Wall Street Journal and The Guardian and Bloomberg, who were scheduled to moderate. After Iranians, mainly Iranians, created a big storm, a Twitter storm, and urged the journalists and the Europeans to pull the plug on the conference. Last night, the conference was postponed. One hopes it'll be canceled, given that Iran just murdered someone from our profession, Paul, a journalist, and it's a regime that's not reformable. So a lot of news is unfolding in this area, and a lot of Israelis were closely following this case.
Yeah, and to you, Itamar, a couple of points here, really. First of all, about Iran's influence within the Palestinian Authority and with Hamas. Do they still have the influence that they once had? And the second, Benjamin just mentioned the Twitter storm that was caused by social media that has caused this postponement of this big event. Why are the same Twitter storms not happening amongst the Palestinian populace, many of whom, and those I've met, genuinely want peace? They just want to get on with their lives, earn a living, just live an everyday life, be free to come and go as they please. Why is that not happening amongst the Palestinian populace? Two quick points there.
Okay, so I'll take the second one first that you asked. Every time Palestinians express themselves, I wouldn't say every time, but very often when Palestinians express themselves on Twitter or on their Facebook page with anything critical of Palestinian Authority policy, they can literally be arrested and sometimes even charged or just tortured in the Palestinian Authority prisons. There are many, many cases like this. There are Palestinian human rights organizations that document this material. So you don't have now what's shocking, or what's I guess amazing, and that you give credit to those Iranians who were willing to make this Twitter storm. That's fantastic that they were doing, because their regime certainly is a dangerous regime as well. But Palestinians are fearful. They don't have secret accounts. It's all traceable. So therefore, they're not opening up and expressing. Like I told you, the Palestinians who I met with a Palestinian from Bethlehem, together with members of a European Parliament, actually Dutch Parliament here in Israel, and And I made my presentation, showed what's happening in the Palestinian world, how children are brought up, showed the videos, and then he spoke about his childhood growing up, and he corroborated everything I was showing there. He said how terrible it was, and then they asked him, well, how many people can you are like you, and how many people know your opinions? And he said, literally just a handful. I'm afraid to let people know my opinions, and that's why there's no Twitter storm. Palestinians are afraid to let people know their opinions. They don't know who's going to turn them in. Now, your first question, remind me again.
It was about Iran and the Iranian influence within the Palestinian political scene.
Right. So the Iranian influence within the PA, it really goes in waves. The Palestinian Authority, which is very interesting, right after the peace broke out between Israel and the Gulf states, one of the first things that happened was there was a statement from the Palestinian Authority about we will be turning to Iran, and there was statements of back and forth between Iranian leaders and the Palestinian Authority. Of course, the Iranians are the ultimate enemy of the Gulf states, but what the PA was telling the Gulf states is, well, if you're going to make peace with Israel, we are going to turn to your arch enemy Iran, and we're going to turn to them again. Iran, of course, is a major threat to Israel, less through the PA and Hamas, and more through Hezbollah. Hezbollah has estimates say between 100,000 and 200,000 missiles in Lebanon. They're trying to establish missile launching bases within Syria as well, so that way Israel would have two fronts to fight in the next war in the north. There's a terrible line that I've heard said many times, is that Iran didn't send 200,000 missiles to Syria so that they would rust there. And that's the scary thing. The question is, when will Iran want those, when will it be in Iranian interest to have Hezbollah fight its next war with Israel? Iran certainly doesn't care about the loss of life of Lebanese nor of the Hezbollah soldiers. So that's the scary thing. Iran is a major player. Iran is, and what surprises me, you're talking, and Benjamin was just talking about this conference. What is it with the Europeans? Don't they understand the leadership? Don't they listen to the statements, the vicious anti-Semitism, the vicious anti-Western statements? We're going to, wipe Israel off the map. Don't they understand? They're talking now about the United States and Israel wanting to stop the building of a bomb in the interest of benefiting Iranians and the whole world. This hasn't been done in a long time, but really, they should be working for regime change. That's the only thing that will save Iranians and the world from a very, very dangerous government.
Well, I'm just going to give the last word on this to Benjamin, which basically picks up on something Itamar said there about the thought process of the Europeans in not condemning Iran maybe as they should do. Is there something in what the Europeans do, from your experience, would you say that is basically a case of them minding their own back because they have very large Islamic populations within their own countries and they don't want to foment any trouble locally, and they feel it's easier to verbally appease Iran than to do the opposite? Do you think that's a factor in the way that the Europeans play the game as regards the Israel-Palestinian question?
Well, I think yes, the growth of European Muslim populations is certainly a factor in many of these countries because of their voting base. But I think the larger issue is Western Europe has been sort of pathologically obsessed with Israel for more than 50 years. And I think a lot of this has to deal with, and I'm putting this in sort of sarcastic and ironic, sarcastic terms, but I think this theory has a lot of weight to it. And that is the Europeans, again, the Western Europeans, won't forgive Israel for the Holocaust. In that sense,
in what respect?
Well, many of these governments and large swaths of their population are filled with pathological guilt about the role of their governments or their citizens, family members in the role of the Holocaust, complicity And in order to purge their pathological guilt, they spend most of their time beating up on Israel and turning the Israel-Palestinian peace process into the not only in the Middle East, but the world. That unless we resolve this dispute, we won't have peace in the Middle East. Of course, that's all nonsense. But I think this idea of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism, or this anti-Semitism in response to the Holocaust needs to be dealt with. I think all the other theories or trying to figure out why the Europeans are so obsessed with Israel doesn't carry as much weight from my perspective as someone who's written about Europe for 20 years as this theory of anti-Semitism in response to the Shoah and why the Europeans are not, it's not about Israel, it's about European guilt about their role in the Holocaust.
It's a very big subject, and of course there's also the revisionist history writing as well to try and wash over some of the complicity of local populations in the acts during the Holocaust. But that's a whole other discussion that we'll get into at another time, because we have virtually run out of time. But very quickly, we've in recent episodes we've been asking our guests just to give a pointer to people visiting Israel, either for the first time or those that come regularly, to find a spot that isn't maybe on the main tourist track or something slightly out of the ordinary. And Itamar, if you were able to recommend one place to people to come and take a look at here, that might not be on the main route, what would you suggest?
Well, I would suggest in the Old City, there has been a massive archaeological dig going on for a number of years now. And they have been uncovering amazing things just a few hundred meters from the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. It's called the City of David. Mm-hmm. Literally every week they find new things that are appearing in the faith. They found little bells that they think were worn by the high priest because it fits the descriptions in the Bible of the high priest. And this is where the high priest would have been walking. It's just an amazing, literally you see thousands of years of history come alive, and you see the actual structures and the finds. I would recommend that for anyone who comes to Israel. To see literally 2,000 years of history, or 2,000 years ago, and even more, literally coming alive, coming to life right in front of them.
Yeah, I've been to the City of David. It is a remarkable place to visit, and it shouldn't be missed for anybody that goes to Jerusalem. Benjamin, you suggested last time in Bokek, I think, on the Dead Sea as your choice. How about another one to throw into the mix?
Well, I suspect because I'm infatuated with the desert, I will suggest another desert pick, and that's Ben Gurion's desert home in the Negev, where he, after he resigned from office, he moved to Kibbutz Sde Boker in the Negev, and there are spectacular views there, and a bottomless level of knowledge and from Ben Gurion and in his desert retreat.
Yeah, another place that absolutely, as you say, the views are absolutely spectacular. As a place to be laid to rest. There's a few great places here when the time comes, but that certainly was a wonderful place that Ben Gurion chose to end his days. It is a spectacular place, and a very good stopping off point as well for those heading off down to Eilat. It's worth making a detour and stopping off at Sde Boker. But that's about all we have time for. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm very grateful both to Itamar Marcus and Benjamin Weinthal. Thank you both for joining us here at Real Israel. It's been good to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to see you.
And thank you both, and we'll be looking forward to you joining us once again next time for more of what the Israeli papers say. Bye-bye for now.